The Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat in the Bavarian Alps, June 5, 1944. The storm that had been battering the English Channel for 3 days showed no signs of letting up. In his study overlooking the mountains, Adolf Hitler reviewed the latest intelligence reports with the satisfaction of a man whose strategic instincts had once again proven superior to his generals. The Führer had been right all along. The invasion, when it came, would strike at Pas-de-Calais. Every piece of intelligence confirmed it. The phantom 1st United States Army Group under Patton, positioned opposite the narrowest point of the Channel, the concentration of landing craft, the bombing patterns, the resistance sabotage, all of it pointed to Calais. Normandy, if the Allies landed there at all, would be nothing more than a diversion, a feint to draw German forces away from the real objective. Hitler had structured his entire defensive strategy around this conviction. In the months leading up to this moment, he had personally taken control of the Panzer reserves, the armored fist that could smash any invasion. His generals, Rommel and Rundstedt, had argued bitterly about where to position these divisions. Rommel wanted them close to the beaches, ready to throw the invaders back into the sea within hours. Rundstedt preferred holding them inland, to be deployed once the Allied intentions became clear. Hitler had chosen a third path. The Panzer divisions would be held under his personal control. Only he could authorize their deployment. Only he possessed the strategic vision to see through Allied deceptions. His generals, for all their tactical skill, lacked his intuitive grasp of the enemy's thinking. This decision had created a command structure of Byzantine complexity. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt commanded all forces in the west, but Field Marshal Erwin Rommel commanded Army Group B, which controlled the actual invasion coast, reporting directly to Hitler as well as through Rundstedt. The Panzer divisions belonged to yet another command structure, and every major decision required Hitler's personal approval. The Führer's daily routine had become increasingly nocturnal. He rarely rose before noon, spent his afternoons in conferences and briefings, took dinner late in the evening, and then held court with his inner circle until 3 or 4 in the morning. On this night, June 5th, his schedule followed its usual pattern. The weather reports pleased him. The storm made invasion impossible. The Allies would not risk their vast armada in such conditions. Even their meteorologists, inferior as they were to German weather science, would see the futility of attempting a crossing. Rommel had seen it too. The Field Marshal had left his headquarters in France 2 days earlier, driving to Germany to visit his wife Lucy for her birthday on June 6th. Before departing, he had told his staff that the weather made invasion unlikely for at least another 2 weeks. He planned to continue from his home to meet with Hitler at the Berghof, to make one final appeal for control of the Panzer reserves. The irony would become apparent only in retrospect. On the night of June 5th, the supreme commander of German forces in the west was at his headquarters far from the coast. The commander of the forces actually defending Normandy was in Germany, and the Führer, who controlled the armored reserves that could decide the battle, was preparing for bed in his mountain retreat, convinced that when the invasion came, it would come somewhere else entirely. Hitler's isolation at the Berghof was both physical and psychological. The mountain compound, built into the Obersalzberg above Berchtesgaden, had become his primary residence. He had spent most of the past 4 months there, away from his military headquarters in East Prussia, away from Berlin, away from the front lines. His world had contracted to this alpine fortress, where he was surrounded by his personal staff, his secretaries, his adjutants, his physician, and the small circle of intimates who shared his late-night monologues. The military situation reports arrived by teleprinter and telephone, filtered through layers of staff, often delayed by hours. Hitler's chief adjutant, General Wilhelm Burgdorf, controlled access to the Führer. His military adjutants, representing the various branches of the Wehrmacht, managed the flow of information. They had learned to present news in ways that would not trigger the Führer's legendary rages. They had learned that waking him from sleep for anything less than a catastrophe risked severe consequences. In the days before June 6th, Hitler had received numerous intelligence assessments. All seemed to confirm his strategic judgment. The German intelligence service, the Abwehr, reported that Allied forces remained concentrated opposite Calais. The Luftwaffe's reconnaissance flights, when weather permitted, showed the same pattern. Radio intercepts suggested that Patton's army group, the most powerful Allied formation, remained in southeastern England. What Hitler did not know, what his intelligence services had failed to penetrate, was that virtually every piece of information reaching him had been carefully crafted by Allied deception planners. Operation Fortitude, the elaborate deception scheme, had created an entirely fictional order of battle. The phantom army group under Patton existed only in radio transmissions, dummy equipment, and double-agent reports. The real invasion force, assembling in ports along England's southern coast, had been hidden through a combination of camouflage, radio silence, and misdirection so thorough that German intelligence had lost track of entire divisions. The weather itself had become an Allied weapon. On June 4th, General Dwight Eisenhower had postponed the invasion by 24 hours due to the storm. His meteorologists, led by Group Captain James Stagg, had predicted a brief window of marginally acceptable conditions on June 6th. The German Weather Service, lacking weather stations in the Atlantic after the Allies had captured or destroyed them, had missed this forecast entirely. Their predictions showed the storm continuing for at least another 2 weeks. As Hitler prepared for bed in the early hours of June 6th, the Allied armada was already at sea. More than 5,000 ships carrying 156,000 men were crossing the Channel. 3 airborne divisions, more than 23,000 paratroopers and glider troops were already in the air or preparing to take off. The largest amphibious invasion in history was underway, and the German Supreme Command remained unaware. The first German units to detect the invasion were coastal radar stations and listening posts in Normandy. Shortly after midnight, radar operators began tracking large formations of aircraft approaching from the sea. At first, the contacts seemed consistent with the bombing raids that had pounded French targets for weeks, but the scale was unprecedented. The aircraft kept coming, wave after wave, and they were slowing down as they approached the coast, as if preparing to drop something. At 1:30 in the morning, soldiers of the 716th Infantry Division, holding positions near the town of Saint-Mère-Église, heard the drone of aircraft engines. Minutes later, the sky filled with parachutes. American paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division were landing directly on top of their positions. Similar scenes unfolded across a broad stretch of the Cotentin Peninsula as 2 American airborne divisions dropped into Normandy. The reports began flowing up the German chain of command. Parachute landings. Large scale, multiple locations. But what did it mean? Was this the invasion, or was it a raid? A diversion? The weather made a major invasion seem impossible, and the landings were in Normandy, not Calais, where all intelligence indicated the main blow would fall. General Erich Marx, commander of the 84th Corps, defending this sector, was in his headquarters when the reports arrived. It was his birthday, June 6th, and he had been celebrating with his staff. The party ended abruptly. Marx, who had lost a leg on the Eastern Front, immediately grasped the significance. This was no raid. This was the invasion. He began issuing orders, moving his limited reserves toward the drop zones, requesting reinforcements from higher command. But the reinforcements Marx needed, the panzer divisions that could crush the airborne troops before they consolidated their positions, were not his to command. They belonged to Hitler. And Hitler was asleep at the Berghof, more than 800 kilometers away. General Alfred Jodl, chief of the Wehrmacht operations staff, was at the Berghof with Hitler. When news of the parachute drops reached him around 3 in the morning, he faced a dilemma. Should he wake the Führer? The reports were still fragmentary. The situation remained unclear, and Hitler had given explicit instructions that he was not to be disturbed during his sleep hours except for emergencies of the highest order. Jodl decided to wait. Let the situation develop. Let more information arrive. The Führer needed his rest. There would be time to inform him once the picture became clearer. As dawn broke over Normandy, the situation became catastrophically clear. At 6:30 in the morning, the first waves of infantry hit the beaches. Utah Beach, Omaha Beach, Gold Beach, Juno Beach, Sword Beach. 5 invasion beaches stretched across 80 kilometers of Norman coastline. Thousands of landing craft disgorged troops and vehicles under covering fire from battleships and cruisers. Fighter bombers swarmed overhead, attacking any German position that revealed itself. The German coastal divisions, under strength and composed partly of conscripted foreign troops, fought with varying degrees of effectiveness. At Omaha Beach, they inflicted terrible casualties on the Americans, turning the water red, covering the sand with bodies. At other beaches, the defenses crumbled more quickly, but everywhere the scale of the assault overwhelmed the defenders. Field commanders began screaming for reinforcements, particularly for the Panzer divisions. The 21st Panzer Division, positioned near Caen, was close enough to potentially reach the beaches within hours, but it could not move without authorization from higher command. And higher command could not authorize its movement without Hitler's approval. At the headquarters of Army Group B, Rommel's chief of staff, General Hans Speidel, tried desperately to get authorization. He called Rundstedt's headquarters. He called Jodl at the Berghof. He called every command authority he could reach. The answer came back: wait for the Führer's decision. The Führer was sleeping. The Führer would be informed when he woke. Around 10 in the morning, Hitler finally rose. His adjutants brought him the news: large-scale landings in Normandy, airborne drops, naval bombardment. But even now, even with the invasion underway, Hitler's first reaction was exactly what his strategic instincts had prepared him to believe. This was the diversion. The real invasion would still come at Calais. The Allies were trying to draw German forces to Normandy to weaken the defenses at the real target. He refused to release the Panzer reserves. The 21st Panzer Division received permission to move, but only that single division, and only after hours of delay. The other armored formations, positioned farther inland, remained frozen in place. Hitler would not be deceived by this obvious feint. His generals, gathering for the daily situation conference, tried to argue. The scale of the Normandy landing suggested this was no diversion. Thousands of ships, tens of thousands of troops. The Allies would not commit such forces to a feint. But Hitler remained unmoved. He had been right about everything else. He had predicted the invasion would come in the summer of '44. He had predicted the Allies would try to deceive him about the location. Now they were executing that deception, and he would not fall for it. The consequences of this decision would unfold over the following hours and days. The 21st Panzer Division, moving piecemeal toward the coast, was caught by Allied fighter bombers and suffered heavy losses before reaching the battlefield. When it finally counterattacked in the late afternoon of June 6th, it briefly reached the coast between Juno and Sword beaches, but lacked the strength to exploit the gap. By nightfall, it had been pushed back. The other Panzer divisions remained immobilized. The 12th SS Panzer Division, the Panzer Lehr Division, the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, all sat in their assembly areas while Allied forces consolidated their beachheads. Every hour of delay allowed the Allies to land more troops, more tanks, more artillery. The narrow window when a determined armored counterattack might have thrown the invasion back into the sea closed steadily. Hitler's conviction that Calais remained the real target persisted for days. Even as the Allies poured reinforcements into Normandy, even as they expanded their beachheads and linked them together, he continued to hold back forces from the 15th Army defending Calais. The phantom threat of Patton's Phantom Army group kept an entire German army frozen in position, waiting for an invasion that would never come. The command structure Hitler had created, centralizing all major decisions in his own hands, had proven catastrophic. Rommel, racing back from Germany, did not reach his headquarters until late on June 6th. By then, the critical first hours had passed. Rundstedt, nominally in command of all forces in the West, lacked authority to deploy the reserves without Hitler's approval. Field commanders, watching their positions being overrun, could not get the reinforcements they needed because those reinforcements belonged to a man sleeping in a mountain retreat hundreds of kilometers away. The delay in waking Hitler, those 6 or 7 hours between the start of the invasion and his being informed, have been debated by historians ever since. Would it have mattered? Could an earlier decision to commit the panzers have changed the outcome? The answer remains uncertain. The Allied air superiority was so complete that moving armored divisions in daylight invited destruction from above. The Allied naval gunfire was so overwhelming that approaching the beaches meant running a gauntlet of shells from battleships offshore. The Allied deception was so thorough that even with earlier information, Hitler might still have believed Normandy was a feint. But the delay symbolized something deeper than a mere tactical error. It revealed the fundamental dysfunction of the German command system by June 1944. Hitler had accumulated all power, all decision-making authority into his own hands. His generals had been reduced to executors of his will, unable to act on their own initiative, unable to respond to battlefield developments without seeking permission from above. And when the decisive moment came, when rapid decision and immediate action were required, the Supreme Commander was asleep and his staff were afraid to wake him. The night before D-Day, Hitler had gone to bed confident in his strategic genius. He had seen through the Allied deceptions. He had positioned his forces to meet the real invasion at Calais. He had retained personal control of the decisive reserves. Everything was in place. When the Allies finally came, he would be ready. He was right about one thing. The Allies had indeed deceived him, but the deception was far more complete than he imagined. It was not that they had fooled him about the timing or the location. They had fooled him about everything. They had created an entirely fictional threat that he had organized his entire defense to counter. They had hidden their real strength so thoroughly that German intelligence had lost track of it. They had predicted that he would centralize decision-making, and they had planned their operation to exploit the delays that centralization would create. Most devastatingly, they had understood his psychology. They knew he believed himself to be a strategic genius, superior to his professionally trained generals. They knew he would trust his instincts over evidence. They knew he would see patterns where none existed, because he needed to believe that he alone could perceive the hidden truth. So they fed him a pattern, a false pattern, and let him convince himself that he had figured it out. On the night of June 5, 1944, Adolf Hitler went to sleep believing he had mastered the situation. By the time he woke on June 6th, the situation had mastered him. The invasion he had prepared for had arrived at a place he had discounted, at a time he had thought impossible, in a manner his command structure was ill-equipped to counter. The panzer reserves he had hoarded so carefully would arrive too late, in too little strength, to change the outcome. The Allies established their beachhead. Within a week, they had landed more than 300,000 troops. Within a month, they had broken out of Normandy and begun the liberation of France. The war that Hitler had started in 1939 would return to Germany itself, carried by the armies that had landed on those Norman beaches while he slept in his mountain retreat. The night before D-Day, Hitler said nothing that was recorded for history. He spoke no prophetic words, made no dramatic statements. He simply followed his usual routine, stayed up late, and went to bed convinced of his own strategic superiority. That conviction, that absolute certainty in his own genius, was perhaps the most consequential thing about that night. It meant that when his staff finally did wake him, When they brought him the news that the invasion had begun, his first instinct was to dismiss it as a diversion. It meant that the hours when decisive action might have mattered were spent waiting for a decision from a man who had convinced himself he already knew what the Allies would do. The silence of that night, the absence of any recorded statement, speaks more eloquently than any speech could have. It reveals a man so isolated, so surrounded by yes-men and filtered information, so convinced of his own infallibility that he had lost the ability to perceive reality. The storm that made invasion impossible was not impossible. The intelligence that confirmed his theories was manufactured. The command structure that gave him total control had paralyzed his armies. When historians examine what Hitler said the night before D-Day, they find mostly absence of awareness, absence of preparation, absence of the flexibility and responsiveness that military success requires. That absence, that void where decisive leadership should have been, was filled only by the supreme confidence of a man who believed he could not be wrong. He was wrong, and by the time he realized it, more than 150,000 Allied soldiers were ashore in Normandy, and the beginning of the end had arrived.